Hey everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my April reading wrap-up. I read 14 books in the month of April. You can always tell it's a good reading month when I have trouble holding up the books for the thumbnail. I think I dropped them like 3 times. But yeah, kind of a mixed bag this month, which, like, to be honest, it always is for me. But all of these books were unread books from my shelves. I didn't buy any books this month, so basically I just knocked 14 books off of my unread TBR. Pretty pleased with that. So let's get into them. So this is not going to be like a 4-hour long video. The first book that I read, and I honestly can't believe this was just a month ago because it feels like, this book feels like forever ago. 3 Hours in Paris by Cara Black. This was an arc, but this book is long released. It's been out for a couple of years now. Does it say on here when this is going to be released? April 2020. This has been out for a minute. This is a historical fiction spy thriller about an American woman who lives in the UK with her husband, and her husband and baby daughter are killed in an attack, and she becomes a spy for the British government and decides to go assassinate Hitler. That's her task. I gave this 2 stars. Not impressed, not real thrilled with this one. I'm not the biggest into like straight spy thrillers because a lot of the times they do feel kind of melodramatic and like over the top and entirely unrealistic, which like this 100% was. Like, in no way do I believe this American woman who speaks French well, but with like a very obvious American accent, which was stated in the book actually, could go to Paris in the middle of the Nazi occupation of World War II, managed to get into an apartment building across from where Hitler was going to be and actually take a couple of shots at him and then get away unscathed. That happens in like the first few pages of this book. And it's just like, in no universe, like, no way, no how, not gonna happen. Apart from that, I do think the story was just told in a fairly boring way. Most of it takes place in the 24-hour, maybe 36-hour period after she takes the shots at Hitler, and it's basically her running away from Nazis and this one particular Nazi who's a policeman investigating and chasing her to catch her. There's nothing in this book that really happens other than that. There are no important characters really other than that. That is just the entirety of this book. It's a very cat and mouse game book, and it was very boring for that. Like, it just didn't do anything. It wasn't exciting because it was, oh, the policeman's chasing her down and she's running away, and he's still chasing her down and she's still running away. And it was just also kind of absurd the amount of stuff that happened in the 24-hour period. She went to all these different places and different locations around Paris and met all these different people, and it was like, oh, wait here and someone will come pick you up, and then that would happen like 20 minutes later, and then 20 minutes after that she'd be in an entirely different location, and not a fan. If you're better at suspending your disbelief than I am, you might enjoy this a little bit more, but I think just in general, it wasn't a very well written book. It wasn't well structured in terms of the story. I didn't care about any of the characters. It was just kind of the whole way through, and I don't know. I don't like when books bore me, and this one bored me a lot. Then I read The Color of Our Sky by Amita Trasi. This is also somewhat historical fiction. A lot of it's set in the 90s and early 2000s in India. A 10-year-old girl is set to become a sex slave in this kind of passed down social hierarchy custom, the same way her mother was, the same way her grandmother was. And instead she becomes a house girl, kind of half servant, half foster sibling to this wealthier family. And then one day she's kidnapped, and the story is then told from the perspective of the daughter in the family, and she moves to America and then eventually decides to go back in order to find out what happened to her childhood friend. I was unfortunately really disappointed by this book and gave it 2 stars. I wanted to love this so much because the story was fantastic. Like, the whole way through, the story itself, the plot, the events that were unfolding were fascinating and like really well developed, and interesting things were happening, and the characters were well done, interesting people. But what really let this book down for me was the writing. I just couldn't get into the writing style at all. I don't think it was structured very well. So much of this book is told from the girls' perspectives, kind of in the future, looking back on these events. And because of that, you get kind of this distance from them. Like, these girls already have a distance from these events, so you as the reader also feel that distance. And it was really hard to feel like I was actually experiencing what was happening in this book and like all these tragic events, and I was sitting there thinking, this is so objectively sad, but I'm not feeling that emotion, which was so unfortunate because that was what this book really needed. And I wanted to love it. Like, the whole way through, I kept trying to convince myself that I was enjoying it more than I was because it was so good. Like, the story fascinated me. It was just like, the writing wasn't really well done. Also, the pacing in this book was really hard for me to follow. It alternates between like the past and the present. Mukta, who's the girl who was kidnapped in her village, and Tara, who's the daughter who went to America, in America and then going back to India to search for her friend. And it alternates between them. It alternates between the past when they were growing up together and then the future in which Tara, the adult, is searching for Mukta. But it was really hard to follow like the timeline of events. Like, the past to the present was obvious, but at one point Tara was in India and was like in her second chapter being in India, and she mentioned that she'd been in India for 3 months. And I have never been so thrown off by a timeline in a book because I literally thought it had been a couple of days. And she's sitting here like, oh yeah, I've been here for months already. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no way, it's been 3 months. Like, within the context of the story that we're being told, it was just like, so much was missed out on. I've never been so confused by that before and just like completely thrown off. It made it really hard to just like follow the narrative itself. She talked about like meeting this other person and I was like, I don't know if she's known this person for a week or if like they too have gone on like a 6-month life journey together that we just didn't get to see. But it was really unfortunate. Like, I wanted to love this so much and I didn't. I don't know. It makes me really disappointed because I tried so hard. I just think the writing let this book down a lot. Then I read Stop Pretending: What Happened When My Big Sister Went Crazy by Sonya. This is a young adult novel in verse about a young teenage girl whose older sister has a mental breakdown and is sent to a psychiatric hospital. This was really, really lovely. I gave it 4 stars. I like Sonya. She's written a number of novels in verse, and I think for the most part, they're all really worth the read. I've been trying to make my way through her backlog and just like get through all of her books, but I think this one was something special. It's semi-autobiographical. It's definitely based on her life and her older sister's struggle with mental illness. Consented by her older sister. She discussed that in the book as well. But this is fiction, and I think it reads a lot more like straight poetry than some of her other books, which I thought I would struggle with more than I did, but it wound up just reading really lovely, really gorgeous. A lot of her books read like you could almost read them as prose, just like broken up into stanzas instead of paragraphs. But this one definitely was just poetry, and it was gorgeous. The emotions were the strongest part for me because Cookie, the main character, feels like such a real person, and like it had me tearing up because like nothing about this book felt over the top or too big. It all just felt so small and real, and like everything in it mattered, and it was really well done. It was so lovely, and I really enjoy Sonya, so I would recommend this. It is a little short, and I think it needed to be a little bit longer. I think a little bit more length would have added to it a lot and benefited this book, just to give it more depth and time to kind of deal with some of these difficult topics. But overall, just like really lovely book. Then I read Sold on a Monday by Kristina McMorris. This is a historical fiction novel set during the Great Depression about a reporter who finds 2 boys sitting on the side of the road with a sign that says 2 kids for sale, and he takes a picture that gets printed in the newspaper, and then that sort of sets off this string of events, as it were, and it follows the newspaper reporter as he tries to kind of change the course of the lives of some children, and he also has a bit of a romance. I gave this 3 stars. I thought it was really interesting, but what drew me to this book was the boys, you know, like he sees these two boys on the side of the road with a sign that says for sale. That's what drew me to this book, like the boys' story, like the story of these children and their family. And unfortunately, you get literally none of that in the book because these boys aren't characters. They're in that one scene at the beginning and then we never return to them. Like, the book is about something entirely different, which isn't bad. It's just not what I was looking for, which kind of ruined my experience a little bit. The actual story has to do with the reporter and these other children who he kind of inadvertently ruins their lives a little bit, and he kind of decides he's gonna make an effort to save them and like fix the problems that he's made. And I just wasn't that interested in the reporter or his life. I was kind of more interested in the aspects of like selling children and the Great Depression and people struggling, and this book kind of seemed like it followed people who were predominantly well off, like not rich, but you know, paying for their rent and their food comfortably and still managing to save a little money. And it just wasn't what I picked this book up for. And it's really hard to experience a book like that because you're trying not to judge it for what it is based on what you wanted it to be. But I just found the actual story in this book kind of boring. I didn't really like the main character. I don't think he carried the book well. I don't think he was interesting enough or multifaceted enough to carry a whole book. He was just a little bit bland and boring. And I also didn't enjoy the romance because I didn't see any chemistry between him or his love interest. Like, there was just nothing on the page that I was feeling there. It was kind of just a void. I don't know. I wasn't a fan of this one. It was okay. Like, it definitely wasn't bad. I didn't not like it, but I did struggle with it a lot, and I wasn't interested by the story that it actually was versus what I expected it to be. Then I read A Coal Miner's Bride by Susan Campbell Bartoletti. This is a historical fiction middle grade diary about a girl who came from Poland to America in order to be the bride of a coal miner in 1896. She's 13, I believe, during this book, and she marries this man at 13 and becomes stepmother and mother to his 3 young children. And it's really sad. I gave this 4 stars. I read a lot of these middle grade diaries, the Dear America series. I think they're really well done. Like, they're great historical fiction books for kids, and also they hold up really well for adults. For the most part, I think they're pretty decent and good. This one was like special. This was definitely very memorable. As I was reading it, it made me feel so many emotions, just like as an adult reading this book about like this 13-year-old child who's getting married, who like has to deal with motherhood, who has to deal with being alone and like running a house by herself. And it's just like really tragic and so normalized within the story. Like, a couple of people definitely point out that she's very young and like she's a child herself basically, but just the way it's normalized in the book is so hard to read, and like in a really great way, because like it was kind of normalized at the time. Like, not that everyone was doing it, but it wasn't totally out of the norm, and it just touched my heart a lot. Like, I think this was a very memorable book and just like really, really well written, and I would recommend like generally anything within this series, but I do think this one was particularly good. Then I read Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld. This is an alternate history book about a universe in which Hillary Clinton decides not to marry Bill Clinton when he proposes, and it breaks off from our reality and goes into this different reality where we're following Hillary Clinton in her adult life, in her own political career, and seeing the way the world has changed with their lack of marriage and relationship. Which, really interesting concept. 3 stars. I was bitterly disappointed by this book. Like, if there was ever anything that I just wanted to love, like so badly I wanted to love this book. I read a book that Curtis Sittenfeld wrote about Laura Bush, or inspired by Laura Bush. It was fictionalized. Really well done, really great character development, called American Wife. And I was kind of expecting the same here, just like that kind of depth of character, the exploration of Hillary Clinton the person, and we kind of didn't get that. There wasn't a lot of character in this book. Like, her personality was kind of bland. there wasn't a whole lot of depth to her. There wasn't a whole lot of exploration of who she was, like really anything more than what we get from her public persona anyways. Like that kind of seemed the extent of her character. And because it lacked that, the book as a whole kind of lacked any driving force. Like there was nothing that really drove the narrative of this story. Like it didn't go that in depth on her character. Her relationship with Bill Clinton really didn't matter, and he wasn't in a great deal of the book. It was a lot about her political campaign, but again, none of that went really far in depth. It was more of like a brief summary to show you how she got to the 2016 election, which was kind of like just a kitschy twist on what happened in our 2016 election. Like Trump is involved, but instead he's supporting Hillary, and Bill Clinton is the billionaire she's running against, and all his crowds at political campaigns are shouting, "Shut her up." And like, I was not really pleased by this book very much. It was still well written. Like, it was definitely a passable book. I just feel so negatively towards it almost because of how much I wanted to love it and how good I expected it to be. And it was fine, but I think it mostly missed the mark. I don't know what exactly it was trying to accomplish because it didn't seem like it accomplished much. I also have a full review on this one that I'll link down below that's basically all of these thoughts in greater detail. So not a bad book, like decent writing. It was okay, but I know Sittenfeld is a great writer, so I kind of wanted this to be a lot more. Then I read The Surgeon by Tess Gerritsen, which is the first book in the Rizzoli and Isles series. This is an adult thriller about a serial killer who likes to remove the uterus of his victims and then slit their throats. Very gruesome, graphic, scary book, which I enjoyed. And then it's also about the cops who track him down. I gave this 3 stars. It was okay. Like, I feel like I don't have much to say about mediocre thrillers most of the time. Like, it was fine. It wasn't anything great. I've heard good things about this series, but I want to give it more time before I'm like, not for me. So this first book was kind of just okay. Very gruesome, very graphic, definitely not for everyone. A lot of the characters were very unpleasant, very violently sexist, which, again, not for everyone. I like that in cop thrillers. I like for the characters to be just like horrible people, like even the good cops who are investigating the crimes. I like it when they're all just despicable human beings. So I did really like that about this book. I didn't really like the romance. It was kind of gross within the context of the story because it's between one of the cops investigating the serial killer and one of the serial killer's surviving victims, and it just was a very bad power dynamic. And also it didn't add anything to the story, and it wasn't really well written. Like, there was no chemistry, so like it didn't accomplish anything, and it sort of just added a lot of negativity. But like, the writing was good, the story structure was good. Like, I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on this one. It was just like a decent thriller. I do want to continue on with the series and see where it goes though. Some Girls Are by Courtney Summers. This is a young adult contemporary novel about one of the popular girls who, after an attempted sexual assault, is shunned by her popular crowd, and she kind of has to redefine herself and live with the bullying that she now is on the other side of. 4 stars. Courtney Summers is a fantastic author. She is just an amazing writer. Like, the way she writes a story, I will read anything she writes. I don't care what it is. I don't care what she's writing about. Like, she's going to write it amazingly. However, that only carries a book so far. This story was basically nothing. I have read this exact plot so many times before. Like, popular girl, or at least semi-popular girl, experiences a sexual assault at the hands of her very popular best friend's boyfriend, and nobody believes her, and she's kind of shunned at school. I have read that so many times. That's the plot of Laurie House Anderson's Speak. It's the plot of Sarah Dessen's Just Listen. It's basically the plot of Courtney Summers' other book, All the Rage. And all 3 of those books, there are more books that I'm not mentioning. I'm just mentioning those 3 because those 3 books are great and really well done, really interesting, like lots of depth within the story and the characters. And all 3 of them are better than this book. just in terms of the story. Like, this book is kind of nothing. Like, the story itself doesn't add anything. It doesn't do anything. Once you know what the plot is, that's kind of like the entirety of it. There's not a lot of depth. There's not a lot of like intrigue or interest. There's not a lot of like interesting things going on to like fill it out and make it unique. It kind of just is that very generic plot. And the only thing that saves it is how great of a writer she is, because were this any other author, I probably would have rated this much lower. As it stands, 4 stars is still the lowest I've ever rated a Courtney Summers book. I am disappointed because I wanted to like love this as a favorite the way I have everything else she's written, but it's just like, great writing can save a book for me, but it can't make it 5 stars, you know? Like, this is really well written, so it's 4 stars, but the story contributes almost nothing. So, I don't know. I was disappointed. But still a good book. If you are interested in reading it, if the story sounds interesting to you, I would say read the other 3 books I mentioned first, because they're better, but Courtney Summers is an amazing author. Then I read Alone by Lisa Gardner, another adult thriller. A sniper who works for the police is not accidentally, he shoots a man who's pointing a gun at his wife. And then it launches a whole investigation, and it's like, oh no, did he make the right call? Did the wife actually set up her husband in order to be pointing the gun at him? In order to be pointing the gun at her to get him shot by the police? And yeah, lots of suspense, lots of twists, lots of exhausting storylines. I gave this 2 stars. I do like Lisa Gardner. She's good at story structure. She's good at like crafting an interesting narrative that like draws me in, even if I don't really care about the characters or the story. But this was not one of her finest moments. I'd say give this book a pass unless you're a hardcore Lisa Gardner fan trying to read everything she's ever written like I am. So, not ideal. Basically, the central point of this case is the cops trying to decide if this woman manipulated her husband into pointing a loaded gun at her and her 4-year-old son. Because obviously, all women are capable of manipulating men into doing this. That was the central question of the story and what this book focused on. I wasn't thrilled by this. And even for a thriller, this was like absurdly implausible. Like, this politically powerful man just like casually releases a hardcore lifer convicted felon from prison randomly on like a Saturday, and apparently this doesn't throw out any red flags for anyone involved. That's just something that happens, and it's like, okay then, you have to have a strong suspension of disbelief for this book. Didn't love it. Don't really have much to say about it. It was very forgettable, which to be honest, most mediocre thrillers are. Not like the worst thing I've ever read, but much better exists, so I wouldn't recommend picking this one up. Dopesick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America by Beth Macy. This is a nonfiction book set mostly around Roanoke, Virginia, about the opioid epidemic. Basically starting with when morphine and heroin were invented in like the 1800s and going through OxyContin and that release, and then that leading to much more heroin in rural areas in Virginia specifically. It's kind of like vaguely about the generalities of the opioid epidemic, but like mostly centered around rural Virginia. I give this 4 stars. I really enjoyed this. This was a really interesting book. She focuses on a lot of different people. It's clear she's a journalist. Her writing's great. Her research was really fantastic, and she does such a fantastic job at humanizing all the people in this book. Like, she focuses on different families who have children who either died or are addicted. She focuses on doctors who prescribed it, who didn't prescribe it, and their fight to like limit the prescription and like the overprescription problem that was faced a lot in the 90s and early 2000s. And it's just like a really well done, interesting book. Like, if you're looking for a book on this subject, I'd highly recommend this. It does focus a lot on the human element and like the people whose lives were affected and what happened to them. So if you're looking for something that's like specifically research based, maybe not for you, but definitely like human interest story, it was fantastic. I love this. My only real complaint was that it was like a little bit too drug negative for my taste. Like, it was just very heavy on drugs are bad. I struggled with that a little bit because she does talk about like prescribing kids Adderall and that being something that leads to them being addicted later in life. And she talks about overprescription being a huge problem, but she never talks about how limiting prescriptions can also be a problem for people who are in chronic pain and who do require these drugs to lead the lives that they want to live. Like, I wish that had been discussed at some point, and she kind of spared like maybe 2 sentences in this whole book to that, like not even acknowledging that that is another side of the problem. And like, I'm not sitting here trying to like argue with anything she said. I just wish she had included that side of the discussion, because I think it would have made this a more well-rounded book. But just really fantastically done. Like, I would not hesitate to recommend this to anyone. The Family Upstairs by Jewell. This is another adult thriller about 3 kids whose lives are tied together. A 25-year-old orphan inherits her family's old house and decides to figure out what happened to the family that she ever knew, because her parents were found dead and both of her siblings were missing and never heard from again. This follows her and presumably are the 2 siblings, both in the past and in the present, kind of unraveling what happened to lead to the deaths that night. I gave this 3 stars. I wanted to read Jewell for a minute because I have heard a lot about her on YouTube, but I don't know. I didn't like the story of this book. It definitely wasn't the kind of story I gravitated towards, and this is an arc. Obviously this book is rather old at this point. She's written several since, but at the point I got this, it was an arc, and I just was not that interested in the story or the characters. Like, I don't understand the characters at all, because the main character has 0 life and 0 personality. She just drops literally every aspect of her being to investigate what happened to her parents and try to track down her siblings. And it was very odd. Like, she is maybe one of the flattest characters that I've ever read. And then neither of her siblings are all that much better than her. But what Jewell does really well is write an engaging story. Like, for how little I cared about the actual plot or the characters, I was entirely engrossed in this book from start to finish. Like, it was just story structure and writing style just completely drew me in. So I do understand the hype for her, and I would be kind of interested in trying one of her other books. Like, maybe if I can find a story that she has where like the plot interests me, maybe between the plot and the writing, I'll really love her, because I do kind of understand after reading this what people see in her books, because just like so engaging, like so well written. So yeah, like not a story for me, but I do understand why people would like it. Then I read The Finishing School by Joanna Goodman. I had previously read The Home for Unwanted Girls by her and really enjoyed that book. I thought it was really well done. This one is about a high-end elite boarding school in Switzerland. This kind of like the place to send young rich girls in Europe, and the main character is there on scholarship. She's Canadian. Her mother had previously gone to that school, and one night towards the end of their senior year, her best friend falls from a balcony and is in essentially mostly vegetative state for the rest of her life because of this. And it's kind of about an investigation of what happened to her that night, what led to it. Was it suicide? Was it an accident? Was it murder? And it's also about the main character in present day and her struggles with fertility. Just felt I should throw that last part out there because that is like a good 2/3 of this book. I gave this 2 stars. I don't understand what this book was trying to do. I'm going to talk about some minor spoilers here because I feel like it's really misleading to talk about this book without discussing some of these things that didn't happen until like halfway through, because for the first half of this book, it's about her meeting her friend Kristina at the school and them building their relationship, and also her in the present day with her husband trying to get pregnant and kind of struggling with their relationship as a result of their inability to have children. And then about halfway, she decides that the best way to get pregnant is to take her best friend's frozen eggs that were taken from her during this vegetative state, and implant them into herself and get pregnant that way. And basically have her comatose best friend's children, that there's clearly no consent for, because like her best friend cannot consent, which like so many issues of legality and morality there. And also, this is not the first time it's happened. The mother of her best friend also did this 7 years earlier, so she has a 7-year-old daughter from her daughter's eggs. I don't know what to say about that. That was never discussed as weird in the book. It was treated as like, oh, well, this is a different way to do it, but equally valid. And I was like, no, let's discuss this. This is sociopathic. Like, I literally thought for a good minute that the main character was gonna be the villain, because I was like, there's no way this can go any other way. And yet, it was just treated as normal. Like, this is different, but normal's all the same. People have families in all kinds of ways. I was like, this should not be one of those ways. I really don't know what to say about this book beyond that, because a lot of other things happened. There's an entirely other story going on as well, but that kind of overshadowed everything. And yeah, that wasn't the book that I thought I was going to be reading. I'm not sure anyone really wants to be reading that book. I wouldn't recommend this. I was confused. It's very off-putting and an unpleasant experience all around. So yeah, if you've read this, please talk to me down below. Like, am I in the wrong here for just like, my entire experience with this book just focuses on that one point, because like I can't get past that. Every time I think about this book, I'm just thinking about that. And yeah, 2 stars. Not a fan. Until that point, I was kind of like, this is a very mediocre 3 stars. And I was like, what? No. Because that kind of took over the whole story for a bit too. And the ending was like this melodramatic stuff that didn't entirely make sense within the book and wasn't really well handled. But okay, it was whatever. Yeah, don't recommend. And my favorite read of the month, Guest House for Young Widows Among the Women of ISIS by Azadeh Moaveni. This is a nonfiction book that centers around several women who joined ISIS. They all come from different walks of life. Some are from Syria, from the city that ISIS took over. Some are from the UK, some are from Germany, some are Tunisian. There might have been a Saudi Arabian thrown in there too. But basically, they come from all walks of life. They come from a variety of cultures and a variety of perspectives. And this book kind of tackles what led them to join ISIS, what led them towards religious extremism. And it doesn't seek to judge or justify like anything that they did. It's just trying to explain their motivations and kind of what happened to lead them down this route, and kind of through the implications of that, what could have been done differently in their earlier lives, what kind of guidance, what kind of education, what kind of love would have pulled them away from that. I gave this 5 stars. I thought this was fantastically done. This is such a great work of journalism. Like, she found all of these women and like interviewed all these women, got them to talk to her in order to tell their stories. And like, these women are terrorists, you know, like she couldn't like find them in America. Like a lot of them, she flew to Africa and the Middle East in order to talk to them. And it was really heartfelt. Like, her journalism is fantastic in this book. Like, it was just so well written and so well crafted. It covers 13 different women, and I really thought that was going to confuse me, because like, it's not the longest of books. It's like just shy of 350 pages, and I thought that would be like too many to follow. But to be perfectly honest, I was fascinated by all of them. They all had like really fully developed sections of the book. Like, she has different information levels about different people. Like, some of the women she wasn't able to interview, like the 4 or 5 girls who left England. They were teenage girls to join ISIS. She was never able to interview any of them. She talked to their families. She kind of looked at interviews the families had done and what the media coverage was at the time in order to like explain the situation and kind of make up for the fact that the girls' perspectives weren't especially in there. But culturally and historically, she has so much information. Like, you really get like a full perspective on this. I mean, like, as much as you can from a 350-page book, but she makes it so easy to understand and to follow and to see where these women are coming from and like why they made their decisions. Like, obviously not the right decisions, you know, but you really understand their perspectives and you understand why for them they felt it was the right decision. And it was just fascinating. The only thing that made me kind of sad about this book was how short it was and like how limited it was in some ways, which, like, obviously not the author's fault. She had very limited access to these women in interviews. Like, these are literal terrorists. Some of them are still in refugee camps. Like, they don't have a place to go. Some go to prison. Some are executed. You know, like, they are terrorists, considered terrorists by the majority of the world. So, like, she can't just go to coffee shops with them in America and have, like, long interviews or go to their homes. Like, it's not possible for her to have that kind of access. So the book did feel, like, a little bit limited in some ways, but I don't think it could have been any more than it was while still being nonfiction. But I genuinely cannot recommend this enough. It was fantastic. It was so well done and so well written, and just like, it really captures so many different cultures and countries and perspectives of like Islam and Islamic extremism. I remember there was one really interesting discussion, I think centering around a Tunisian girl, where one of her friends and someone who lived in the country basically said that because religion is so important there, but there's so little education actually about their religion, it's really easy to manipulate people into thinking like certain things are good for their religion or certain things are expected in their religion, because they don't have the religious background in order to like combat that. Like, they're not educated enough within their religion, yet that religion is such an important part of their lives that like it's easy to turn them towards extremism. And it was just like a lot of interesting discussions like that. But fantastic book. Like, if I want to recommend anything, it's this. Like, this has been the best thing I've read so far this year. And then the last book I read, lovely disappointing read, The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. This is apparently a science fiction classic. I didn't know that going in. I just picked up this book because it had an interesting sounding story and it was in a thrift store. But yeah, very beloved, very important in terms of science fiction literature, apparently. I give it 2 stars. This is a Vietnam allegory that is basically about a war where people are drafted and have to fight aliens, and there's a lot of time dilation. So like, the timeline of it is kind of skewed because like 6 months of his life will go by and then like 100 years on Earth have gone by. So that's kind of a big part of the book. And then like the fighting of aliens and like the military stuff. I didn't like much about this. It was very dry. Like, so much of this book focused on like the specific aspects of military and the fighting and the formations and what types of weapons are being used, and then like the science fiction aspects of like what speed they're traveling through space and like what that does to their bodies, and then what their lasers are and how that was created. And it's kind of like what I don't like about science fiction, because I really can't follow anything like that. It's just like nothing to me. Like, I don't have a mind for science, so I really struggle with that. And so much of this book was just like going over those basic things kind of at the expense of the story and the characters. The main character in this book had basically no personality. None at all. His name was William Mandela. I remember because it was like really close to Joe Haldeman's last name, which was odd. Not the only way. This kind of felt like a self-insert book. Yeah, he was basically nothing. None of the other characters were anything. I didn't care about anyone in this book. So many people died, and I was like, did I know you? Like, was I supposed to care about your death? I don't know. And then because of the time dilation, so much happened off screen, and then like characters would explain it to the main character well after the fact. They would like summarize all the societal changes on Earth, everything new that had happened in the war, like all the new developments in existence would just like get summarized to the main character in dialogue, which like is not a good way to tell a story. Like that is by definition the opposite of showing, not telling. And it was so boring. Like I was never once really entertained by this book. The only thing I kind of liked was the romance, like a little bit. It kind of seemed very interesting because it wasn't a very typical romance. That was kind of a little bit interesting. But then to get into like some of the weird things, to at least hit on them. Basically when they were in the military together, it was 50% men, 50% women, and everyone would get a bunkmate every night of the opposite sex to sleep with and have sex with, and it was just randomly assigned. And this was never discussed at any point. As far as I'm aware, this was not like some commentary on society. This was either some weird self-insert fantasy that the author wanted to have a lot of sex, or it was his way of just adding a lot of easy gratuitous sex to the book. Either way, it was really weird and sexist and gross and had no purpose of existing. Like at the beginning I was kind of cool with it because I was like, oh, I can't wait to see what he does with that. And then, oh, nothing. He has nothing to say about that. The main character has zero opinion on that. Like, I don't understand what was happening there. But yeah, that was odd. And then there was this whole background story on Earth where basically in order to combat overpopulation, Earth was like, everyone should be gay now. Because apparently that is the only way to fight overpopulation. So everyone on Earth became gay because that's how that works. And then being straight was criminalized. It was strange. But it's also like, this book was written in the 70s. Like, if that was written today, I would have a lot more to say about it. But like, perhaps that was him trying to be progressive? I don't know. It made me uncomfortable though. It was just like, it had nothing to do with the story either. Like, I don't know. It was confusing because it was just like utterly pointless within the story, and then also just like incredibly homophobic and like, I don't know. And it wasn't really discussed in any of the reviews that I read on Goodreads. Like, I'm sure it's discussed in some reviews, but like none of the ones I read, which again threw me because it's such like, it happens frequently in the book that it's discussed, and it just like, that's not where I was expecting this to go. And then like, it was an allegory for Vietnam, so the ending was very obvious. Like, I don't know what to say. Like, it would have been interesting had it had depth, but like the general meaning of the story seemed very shallow and kind of nothing, and it happened off screen and was summarized in a book for them at the end, which like, I don't know, it seemed like he was trying to get around writing an actual story. But I wasn't a fan. I probably won't be picking up any more of his books. I didn't like this one, but yeah, this is apparently a beloved classic. I didn't like this one. I wouldn't recommend this one, but apparently everyone else who reads sci-fi would. So, if you've read this and want to discuss some of my thoughts, please do comment down below, because like, I was confused, and I'm confused why this is so beloved, because it didn't seem like a very well written book. But yeah, 14 books in April was kind of a fantastic reading month. Didn't love all of them, but that's okay. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them if you have, especially The Forever War and The Finishing School, because both those were just like so weird. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.